The desert wind carried a thin layer of dust across the ground as the sun climbed higher, sharp and merciless. A small figure walked beside a man, her hand swallowed inside his rough, trembling grip. Her name was Nefertari, only 9 years old, but her world was already collapsing in ways she could not understand. Her father did not look at her, not once. They walked toward the temple of Ammon, its white stone walls glowing in the heat like the bones of some ancient giant. To Nefertari, the temple had always been a place of mystery, a place people respected from a distance. But today, it felt like something alive, something watching her. She tried to speak. "Father, why are we going here?" Her voice was thin, almost lost in the wind. He squeezed her hand, not gently, not cruelly, but with a heaviness that felt like sorrow wrapped in fear. "Do not speak," he whispered. His voice cracked. "Just walk." Nefertari obeyed. She always obeyed, but her small heart beat loudly in her chest, each step shaking her from the inside. They reached the great entrance, where two tall priests stood like statues. Their skin was painted in sacred patterns, their eyes cold, measuring, as if they were not looking at a child, but an object being delivered. One priest stepped forward. "You have brought your offering?" he asked. Her father lowered his head. "Yes, I bring my daughter to settle the debt I owe." Nefertari did not understand the words. Debt? Offering? Her small fingers slipped from her father's hand, reaching for him again, but he stepped back, and in that moment she saw fear in his eyes. Fear of the priests, fear of the temple, fear of the gods, but not fear for her. The priests took her by the arms. Their hands were cold, almost metallic, gripping her with the certainty of men who had done this countless times. She gasped, trying to twist away. "Father," she cried. But he did not move. He did not try to help. He did not even look. One of the priests spoke softly to him. "Your debt is forgiven." The words hit Nefertari harder than the grip on her arms. She stared at her father, confused, waiting for him to take her back, waiting for him to say it was all a misunderstanding. But he turned away. He walked down the steps, his shoulders shaking, his eyes wet, but he did not stop. He left her, and Nefertari felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The priests dragged her into a dark hall, lit by torches. The smell of incense was thick, choking her lungs. Shadows danced across the walls, creating shapes she did not want to look at too long. A voice rose from deeper within the hall. "Bring the girl forward." They led her into a room filled with strange tools and bowls of oils. In the center was a stone chair, too large for her small body, shaped like a throne, but cold as death. "Sit," a priest ordered. Her voice trembled. "Please, I want to go home." One of them knelt in front of her, tilting her chin up with a single finger. His smile was calm, too calm. You were brought to serve the gods. This is an honor. If you resist, Ammon will be angered, and when gods are angered, people suffer." Nefertari froze. She didn't fully understand, but the word suffer echoed inside her. Her legs weakened. She sat. A priest took a knife, not sharp, dull, made to scrape, not to cut cleanly. He placed his hand on her head, pressing it still. "We begin the first ritual, the shaving of the hair, the removal of all earthly identity." Nefertari's breath hitched. "Please, don't." But the blade touched her scalp anyway. The scraping sound filled the room, slow, rough, tearing at her hair, leaving burning lines across her skin. Her braids fell to the floor one by one. She cried silently at first, then louder. But the priests continued as if her pain was nothing more than background noise. When they finished, she trembled. The air felt cold against her bare head. She whispered, "Why? Why are you doing this?" A priest answered without emotion, "To make you pure." But purity in this temple did not mean kindness. Two priests lifted her from the chair and carried her to another chamber. This one was filled with steam, bowls of herbs, and a pool of water that looked warm but felt dangerous. "Place her in the purification bath," the high priest commanded. Nefertari struggled. "No, please, please, I want to go home. I'll be good. Her words broke as they forced her toward the water. One priest leaned close and whispered in her ear, his breath cold against her skin. "If you fight, the gods will punish you. If you scream, Ammon will hear, and he will not be pleased." Her heart turned to ice. They lowered her into the bath, not gently, not respectfully. Their hands examined her, touched her, checked her body as though she were a thing and not a child. She cried until her throat hurt, but no one stopped. The rituals went on. The priests kept speaking of purity, of divine duty, of sacred purpose. But all Nefertari felt was fear, sharp as a knife. When they were finished, she was carried out of the chamber, wrapped in a thin cloth. Her small body shook uncontrollably. One priest said, "She will serve the temple now. Her voice will be trained, her mind shaped, her will broken and rebuilt." But they didn't have to break her voice. They didn't have to train it, because when they placed her alone in a small stone room, finally leaving her in silence, Nefertari curled in the corner, knees to her chest, hands covering her ears, and she never spoke again. Not a sound. The temple had taken even that from her. The temple was quiet, but not peaceful. Its silence was heavy, like a thick cloth pressed against Nefertari's small ears. Every step she took echoed against the stone walls, and each echo reminded her that she was alone. Not just alone, trapped. The next morning, before the sun had risen, she was dragged from her corner by two older women. Their hands gripped her arms tightly. Nefertari tried to pull away, but it was useless. "You will learn your place," one of them said, her voice cold. "Do not resist, do not cry, the gods are watching." They led her down narrow corridors where shadows seemed to twist like living things. Her bare feet scraped against the stone, each step sending shivers of fear up her spine. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt locked. She had learned the first rule of the temple: silence equals punishment. Finally, they arrived at a large circular chamber. The walls were lined with stone basins, filled with water that glimmered faintly in torchlight. Steam rose, curling in the air like ghostly fingers. "This is the purification bath," one priest announced. "Only those pure in body and soul may serve the gods. You will become pure." Nefertari looked at the water. It seemed innocent, inviting even, but she remembered the hands, the scraping of the blade, the fear that had stolen her voice. Something told her that this bath would not be gentle. One of the women pushed her toward the pool. "Into the water, child, and do not resist." Nefertari's small body shook violently. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The priests surrounded her, their eyes unblinking. Their calmness made the terror worse. She lowered herself into the cold water, shivering as it lapped over her skin. The priests began their examination, not softly, not carefully, but methodically. Their hands roamed over her body, checking, prodding, testing her like a sculptor shaping clay. Each touch was disguised as ritual, each movement hidden under the language of purity. "You must be clean in body," the high priest said, "and clean in heart. Do you understand?" Nefertari only shivered. She did not understand. How could she? She was only 9. She did not know what a heart or body could mean to them, only that hers no longer belonged to her. The bath continued for what felt like hours. Nefertari stopped trying to pull away. She stopped fighting. She began to float inside her mind, drifting far from the temple, far from the priests, far from the cold water and harsh hands. She imagined her mother's face, warm and kind, smiling at her. She imagined the streets of her village, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of children. Anything to escape the present. But reality was relentless. One of the priests leaned close and hissed in her ear, "Obedience is sacred. Resistance angers the gods. Disobedience will cost you your life." Nefertari froze. Her chest tightened. She realized that this was no longer a test. This was control. Every ritual, every touch, every word was a chain. She was not here to serve the gods. She was here to be broken. When the bath ended, the priests lifted her from the water and wrapped her in a thin linen cloth. She trembled uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered. Her skin was raw from the cold, and her small hands shook so violently that she could barely stand. "You will learn to serve," one priest said. "Your body is not yours, your thoughts are not yours. You belong to the gods." Nefertari wanted to cry, to scream, to fight, but she could not. She had no voice, not a sound came out. The silence pressed down on her like a stone. Every nerve in her small body felt sharp, alert, terrified. and she understood something that no child should ever understand. The temple had claimed her completely. Later that day, she watched other girls brought in. Some had older faces, some were younger, but all shared the same wide-eyed fear. They did not speak, they did not move freely. Their bodies, their minds, their hearts were no longer their own. Nefertari tried to remember her own name. She whispered it in her mind, Nefertari. But the priests had already begun the next stage of erasure. Soon, even that name would be gone. She shivered and pulled her knees to her chest in the corner of the stone room, watching shadows twist along the walls. Her heart beat loudly in her chest. Her body belonged to the temple. Her mind belonged to the temple. Soon, even her memories would belong to the temple. And in that moment, Nefertari understood the cruel truth. She had been given away forever. Forever. There was no escape. There would be no home. There would be only the temple. The temple walls glimmered in the light of the torches, but to Nefertari the glow did not warm her. The cold stone and sharp shadows reflected everything she had lost. Her hair, once long and braided, had been stripped from her head. Her childhood had been torn from her. And yet the priests were not finished. A voice rang out, echoing across the chamber. Prepare her for renaming. She will now take a new identity, a name worthy of the gods. Nefertari tried to stand, but her small body trembled so violently that she collapsed to the floor. One of the older priestesses grabbed her by the arm and yanked her upright. "You will obey," the woman hissed. "There is no room for weakness. You are nothing now, nothing but what we create." The words cut deeper than any blade. Nefertari had felt pain before, but never such complete emptiness. She looked at the bronze mirror on the wall. The reflection staring back at her was strange and unrecognizable. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hair gone, her face pale and trembling. That child in the mirror was not Nefertari. She had ceased to exist. The priests gave her a new name, Nefer-Nebet. Beautiful is the lady. They repeated it slowly, letting it echo through the stone hall. Then they demanded she say it aloud. I am Nefer-Nebet, she whispered, her voice quivering. "No," the priest said sharply. "You will never speak your old name again. It is dead. Your family has forgotten you. Your past is forgotten. You are a creation of the temple. Only the gods may speak through you." She bowed her head. The words were not a blessing. They were a sentence. The next ritual was called the shaving, but Nefertari's head had already been shaved, so now it became ceremonial, symbolic. The priests ran their hands over her scalp, brushing away any lingering traces of hair. Each touch reminded her she had no identity, no name, no choice. Other girls were brought in as well. They cried softly, their small bodies shaking with fear. Some screamed, some resisted.
but each girl was forced through the same rituals. A priestess whispered to Nefertari as they worked, "Your hair is not beauty, it is attachment to the profane. Your name is not your own, it is the weight of your family. Throw it away, give yourself entirely to the gods." Nefertari swallowed a sob. How could she give herself to anything when her body and mind were no longer hers? After the ceremonial shaving, Nefertari was led to a quiet room. She sat on the cold stone floor, clutching her knees. The other girls around her were silent. Some stared blankly at the walls. Some had stopped crying long ago, their faces hollow and expressionless. She tried to remember the streets of her village, the smell of fresh bread, the songs her mother used to sing. She tried to hold on to herself, but the temple was patient. It would take her slowly, day by day, ritual by ritual, until nothing remained. The older priestess approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You will learn your place. You are now the temple's. Your old life is dead. Your name is dead. Your voice will be trained. Your thoughts will be shaped. Obedience is your life. Remember that." Nefertari closed her eyes. She wanted to scream, to run, to call out for her father, but no sound came. Her identity was gone. Her name was gone. Her childhood was gone. She was Nefert-Nebet now, nothing more. Days passed in silence. Nefertari learned quickly that speaking was dangerous. Even a whisper could bring punishment. Other girls had been struck for a sound too loud, for a word spoken without permission. She watched a girl named Takayat whisper once while working at the looms. The overseer struck her across the neck, and Takayat was dragged away. She returned after 3 days, silent, her eyes empty. Nefertari realized the lesson. Safety meant silence. Obedience meant survival. Her heart ached, but she learned to fold it away, to shrink herself inside her own mind. She began to practice speaking only in thoughts, holding conversations inside her head where no priest could punish her. She began to understand the cruel system. The temple did not merely take her body, it claimed her mind, her voice, her very self. By the end of the week, Nefertari had stopped crying. She had stopped asking questions. She had stopped hoping. She was becoming the shadow the priests wanted her to be. And that shadow would have to survive.
The inner sanctum of the Temple of Amun was unlike anything Nefert-Nebet had ever imagined. The walls towered above her, carved with hieroglyphs depicting gods, kings, and priestesses moving in eternal rituals. Golden torches lined the corridors, casting flickering shadows that made the statues of Amun appear alive. Every surface seemed to watch her, judging her, reminding her that she belonged here, not to herself, not to anyone else. She shivered despite the warmth of the flames. Today, they said, she would be married to the god. The words sounded like a blessing, but deep inside, Nefert-Nebet felt the coldest fear she had ever known. She was 14, small and fragile. Yet they treated her as if she were a grown woman, ready to be bound for life. Her hairless scalp burned where the priests had shaved it years before. Her hands trembled as they dressed her in the finest white linen, a robe that felt stiff and suffocating. Golden necklaces and bracelets were placed carefully on her wrists and neck. Finally, a wig of black hair was set on her head, ornate and foreign, covering the emptiness of her own. She barely recognized herself in the polished bronze mirror. "Remember," whispered the priest, leaning close, his voice low and cold, "if you resist, you insult Amen. Obey, and you are blessed." Nefertnebet wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no sound came. She had learned long ago that voice belonged to the temple now. Her body was theirs, her voice theirs, her life theirs. Two priests guided her trembling legs down the corridor to the inner chamber. The room was enormous, filled with statues of gods and goddesses. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her every movement. Incense choked the air, thick and suffocating, clinging to her skin, her linen, and her soul. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but she could not. She knelt before the largest statue, Amen, God of kings and skies. The high priest approached, his face hidden behind a golden mask, his hands steady, cold as stone. "You are chosen," he said, his voice booming as if the God himself spoke through him. "Pure, obedient, blessed. Your body is now Amen's temple. Your life is his property. You will serve in purity and obedience forever." Nefertnebet nodded, though her mind screamed. She did not understand the words fully, but she felt their weight in every fiber of her being. This was no blessing. This was a sentence. She was being bound, not in marriage, but in ownership. The high priest raised his hands, reciting the sacred vows in a voice that shook the walls. Nefertnebet repeated each phrase mechanically. "I take the vows. I give myself to Amen. My body is his temple. My life is his property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. They sounded holy, but inside she felt chains tightening around her mind and soul. She was 14 years old, and her future had been stolen. There would be no marriage to a man, no children that would be hers to raise, no freedom of thought, no escape. After the vows, she was led to a small dormitory, a room crowded with girls who had already undergone the same ritual. Some were older, some younger, but all moved with the same distant, empty expressions. They did not speak, did not laugh, did not cry. They were shadows of the children they had once been, prisoners disguised as sacred servants. Nefertnebet sat quietly, clutching her knees to her chest. The room smelled of sweat, incense, and fear. She watched as an older girl, maybe 16, traced a faint symbol on the wall with her finger. A silent rebellion, a secret message hidden in plain sight. Nefertnebet's heart skipped a beat. Even here, in the prison of stone and ritual, the mind could resist.
Her thoughts drifted to Mutamuya, the Nubian girl who had been taken years before as tribute. Mutamuya was 8 when soldiers dragged her from her village, tying her to other children for weeks-long marches through the desert. She did not speak the Egyptian language, and her cries for her mother were silenced with harsh blows. Now, dressed in silk linen, her eyes hollow, she sat beside Nefertnebet, a living reminder of what years in the temple could do to a child's spirit. The high priest returned to the room, inspecting the girls with cold, unblinking eyes. He touched Nefertnebet lightly, but the weight behind that touch was terrifying. "Remember," he said, "your body is no longer yours. Your mind is no longer yours. You belong to Amun." Even in her fear, a tiny ember of defiance burned. Nefertnebet remembered what she once was, a child with a name, a voice, a family. The temple wanted to erase that completely, but in secret she promised herself she would remember. Not even the gods, not even the priests could take her memories. Days passed in silence, filled with work that was disguised as service. She learned quickly that any sound could bring punishment. Even a whisper could mean a beating. One girl, Takayet, had whispered a single word while weaving at the loom. The overseer struck her across the neck and dragged her away. She returned 3 days later, silent, her eyes empty. Nefertnebet watched carefully, storing every lesson. Obedience meant survival. Silence meant life. The sacred union ceremony haunted her. She could not forget the weight of the priest's hands, the coldness of the stone beneath her knees, the sound of the high priest's booming voice as he forced her to speak vows she did not understand. Even now, the memory of the ceremony made her stomach turn, her small body curling instinctively into herself. But there was more. Nefertnebet began to see the system in full, the chain of control that bound every girl in the temple. The priests claimed divine authority to touch, command, and dominate. Every ritual, every command, every examination was a calculated method of control. They taught fear disguised as holiness. They taught obedience disguised as devotion, and they succeeded, slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. Even in this horror, Nefertnebet learned to observe. She learned the smallest acts of rebellion that could survive in secret. A glance, a small mark on the weaving, a note carved in stone where no priest would see. Some resistance was possible, hidden, subtle, invisible. It was all that remained of freedom. For now, however, she was silent. She had no name she could speak aloud, no body she could call her own, no future she could claim. She was Nefertnebet, the god's chosen, bound for life. And yet, even as the high priest left the room, his shadow stretching long across the floor, a small, stubborn thought echoed inside her mind. I will remember who I was. They cannot take that. It was faint, fragile, but it was hers. And sometimes in the
Life inside the temple was a prison disguised as devotion. For Nefertnebet, mornings began long before sunrise. The torches were lit, and the corridors filled with the sound of bare feet scraping against stone. Hundreds of girls moved in silence, their eyes downcast, their voices swallowed by fear. Even a whisper could bring punishment. The dormitories were crowded. Girls slept on thin mats, shoulder to shoulder, with older attendants watching over them like hawks. There was no privacy, no comfort, no laughter. Every sound was measured, every movement observed. Nefertnebet learned quickly that life inside the walls demanded obedience above all else. Each day began with the purification ritual. The girls were led to stone basins filled with water, mixed with natrum, a natural salt used in sacred rites. They stripped, their bodies cold in the water, their skin stinging. The priests inspected them carefully under the pretense of ensuring purity. But Nefertnebet knew better. Every touch, every glance was control. Their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the temple. After the baths came labor. Girls wove linen, ground grain, prepared offerings, and cleaned the sanctuaries. The work was endless, monotonous, designed to wear down the body and spirit. Mistakes were punished severely. One girl, Takayat, whispered during weaving once. The overseer struck her neck with a wooden stick and dragged her away. She returned 3 days later, silent, her eyes empty of life. Nefertnebet watched silently, taking note. Obedience was survival. Silence was safety. Meals were eaten in strict silence. The girls were given little to eat and no water beyond what was needed to survive. The high priest sometimes walked among them, inspecting for defiance. His presence was a constant reminder. The temple claimed not only their bodies, but their minds. Thoughts of freedom were dangerous, and even fleeting glances of resistance could bring punishment. Education inside the temple was only a tool for obedience. Girls learned the language of the priests, the rituals of the gods, and their assigned roles. They were trained to believe that submission was sacred, that their bodies were temples, and that the priest's control was divine. Nefertnebet memorized the chants, the prayers, the gestures, but deep inside, she kept a tiny spark of her own thoughts alive. Friendships were forbidden. Any attempt to connect could be punished. Yet human connection found a way. Nefertnebet quietly bonded with Mutamya, the Nubian girl who had been brought to the temple as a child. They could not speak openly, but they shared subtle gestures, fleeting glances, and small acts of solidarity. Sometimes they hummed songs under their breath, silent enough that the priests did not hear. It was dangerous, but necessary. Without some connection, the weight of isolation could crush the mind entirely. The temple's control extended further than work and silence. The girls' bodies were constantly monitored. Regular inspections were performed to ensure ritual purity, but they were invasive and humiliating. Nefertnebet learned to dissociate during these examinations, letting her mind drift to memories of home, the smell of bread, her mother's soft voice, the laughter of her father. This was her only escape. The high priest sometimes selected girls for sacred unions. These were described as blessings, but Nefertnebet knew their truth. Acts of violation disguised as divine ritual. The girls were chosen based on obedience,
appearance, and ritual designation. Those who resisted or showed emotion were punished severely, sometimes publicly, to teach the others the cost of defiance. One day, Nefertnebet saw the fate of a girl named Renutma, who dared to shout that the temple's rituals were not holy. The high priest dragged her outside into the desert, leaving her alone under the burning sun without food or water. The other girls were forced to watch, learning a lesson in terror. Renutma's body was found the next morning, partially consumed by wild animals. The priests declared her returned to the gods, but the truth was clear. Rebellion led to death. The temple was also a place of loss and grief. Girls who gave birth had their children taken. Sons were raised as priests, daughters trained to serve. Nefertnebet remembered hearing about girls who had tried to hide their children, only to be discovered and punished. One older woman whispered to her, "Do not hope too much. Once your child is taken, your life continues, but a part of you dies. That part belongs to the temple now." The psychological weight of life inside the walls was relentless. Every day, girls were reminded of their powerlessness. Even small acts of defiance were dangerous. Yet, survival required a balance. Obey enough to remain alive. Resist quietly to preserve a piece of self. Nefertnebet learned to navigate this delicate existence. She spoke only when necessary, moved only when watched, and carried memories of her family in secret. The temple tried to erase her identity, but she refused to let them fully succeed. Inside, a small ember of Nefertari, the child she had once been, remained alive. Life inside the temple was a constant test of endurance. Each day brought work, ritual, surveillance, and fear. Each day taught submission. Each day erased another fragment of childhood. But in the shadows, some girls whispered, hummed songs, or made marks in weaving. Silent rebellion persisted, even in the bleakest moments. For Nefertnebet, survival meant mastering both obedience and secrecy. She had no home, no family, no voice. Yet she would live, because the spark inside her could not be extinguished.
The air inside the temple was thick with incense, but it did little to mask the tension. Nefertnebet's small hands trembled as she walked down the corridor toward the inner sanctum. Today, she had been chosen for a sacred union, one of the most feared rituals in the temple. The priests called it a blessing, a holy act, a union with the god. But the girls who had gone before her knew the truth. It was a ritualized violation, a ceremony of ownership disguised as holiness. At 14, she was still a child in every sense of the word, but the temple demanded that she act as though she were an adult. Her body had been trained to obey, her mind taught to silence itself, her spirit forced into submission. She felt every step down the long stone corridor like it was carrying her further from herself, further from Nefertari, the girl who had once played in the streets and dreamed freely. The chamber was dark and cold. Statues of gods and goddesses loomed over the stone floor, their faces stern, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. The walls were painted with scenes of divine myths, But to Nefertnebet, they were not inspiring, they were warnings. Each scene reminded her of the power the priests wielded over her, of the lives they could take, and of the control they held over her body and mind. The high priest entered, his face hidden behind an ornate mask, his hands gloved in golden cloth. He moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring that every girl in the chamber understood the gravity of the moment. The other priests flanked him, their eyes sharp, their presence suffocating. There was no room for hesitation, no space for fear to be acknowledged. Resistance was impossible. You are chosen, pure, blessed, obedient. Your body is a temple. Your life belongs to the gods. Tonight, you take part in a sacred union. Remember, defiance is blasphemy. Submission is salvation. Nefertnebet's small hands trembled, and her stomach tightened. She wanted to cry, to beg for mercy, but her voice had long since been stolen. She knew she had no choice but to obey. The ritual began. She was dressed in fine linen, her bald head covered by an ornate wig, her small body adorned with jewelry. She knelt before the statue of Ammon, repeating prayers she barely understood. The priests moved around her, chanting, their voices echoing off the stone walls. They claimed the god himself was present, guiding their hands, watching their actions. One priest stepped closer. His hands were cold as they rested on her shoulders. Nefertnebet froze, her heart hammering. She could feel the weight of the god's authority pressing down on her, but she knew the truth. It was the priests, not Ammon, who commanded her, who touched her, who owned her. The high priest raised his voice, repeating the sacred words of ownership. Your body is no longer your own. Your life belongs to the gods. You are theirs to command, theirs to use, theirs to shape. The words echoed in her ears like chains tightening around her chest. Nefertnebet shut her eyes, wishing desperately for the world to end, for the walls to crumble, for someone to save her. But she knew no one would come. She was utterly alone. This was not her first sacred union. Some girls endured them many times. Nefertnebet had heard whispers about older girls, their bodies marked by repeated rituals, their minds hollowed by years of obedience. Some had children who were taken away immediately to serve the temple themselves. Others had tried to resist, only to be punished in ways so cruel that their screams haunted the corridors for weeks. The temple's records framed these acts as holy and blessed, but for Nefertnebet, the truth was unmistakable. These rituals were designed to break girls, to strip them of any remaining identity, to ensure absolute control. Every touch, every word, every gesture was a reminder that she belonged to the temple and to the priests who claimed to represent the gods. After the ritual, Nefertnebet was led to a small chamber where other girls who had participated in sacred unions rested. They were quiet, subdued, their faces pale and empty. Some were older, some were younger, but all bore the same expression of silent suffering. The room smelled of sweat, incense, and fear. Nefertnebet curled into herself on the cold stone floor. Her thoughts drifted to Mutiyama,
the Nubian girl who had arrived as a child and endured years of abuse and training. She thought of Takayat, who had been struck for speaking, and of Renutma, abandoned to the desert for daring to defy the priests. These memories were a heavy weight, but they also reminded her of one truth. She was still alive, still conscious, still capable of remembering. That was her only remaining freedom. She realized something else. Resistance could survive, even here, even in secret. Some girls left tiny marks in their weaving, tiny scratches in the stone, subtle signals that said, "We are still here. We remember who we are." It was the only rebellion the temple could not erase. In the days that followed, Nefertnebet observed the system of control with new clarity. The sacred union was not a blessing, but a method. The priests claimed divine authority to command obedience, enforce silence, and demand submission. The rituals were carefully crafted to instill fear, to erase identity, and to prevent any thought of escape. Nefertnebet began to see patterns. Girls were trained from a young age to obey, isolated from family, subjected to examinations disguised as rituals, and punished for the slightest defiance. The temple's power was absolute, yet fragile. It depended on the girls' fear, their learned silence, and their conditioned submission. Small acts of defiance, however subtle, were the only proof that humanity could survive inside these walls. One night, alone in her dormitory, Nefertnebet hummed a tune she remembered from her childhood, a song her mother had sung. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it reminded her that some part of her still existed, untouched by the priests, untouched by the temple. She whispered the words in her mind, "I am still here. I am still Nefertari. They cannot take that." The sacred union had taken much from her, her body, her name, her innocence, but it had not taken her memory, nor her mind. That tiny ember of resistance would be her shield in the long years to come. Inside the temple, survival was measured in silence, endurance, and subtle defiance. And Nefertnebet knew that if she could hold on to that ember for a moment, she could endure. The priests and gods might claim her body, the walls might trap her, and the rituals might break her, but they could never erase who she had been or the memory of what she once loved. Inside the temple, amidst the chains of obedience and fear, that ember of self would be enough to survive another day.
Years inside the temple passed like shadows, moving across stone. Time was measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the rituals, the examinations, and the endless labor. Nefertnebet, now a woman in her 20s, had long since ceased to remember life beyond the temple walls. Her body had been molded by the sacred unions, her mind trained for obedience, her heart hardened by loss. And yet, somewhere deep inside, the ember of her former self, the child Nefertari, still glowed faintly. She moved through the temple corridors with quiet precision. Every gesture, every step, every glance was calculated to avoid punishment. She had learned the rhythm of survival. The younger girls watched her, seeing a woman who had endured the sacred unions, the inspections, and the punishments without breaking. She became a shadow of authority in the dormitories, a silent guide who taught them the rules of endurance. Nefert and Nebet had borne children, daughters and sons, each taken from her shortly after birth. The girls were trained to serve the temple, the boys trained to become priests. She watched their tiny faces disappear into the system she herself had been trapped in as a child. The loss was unbearable, a pain so deep it could not be spoken aloud. She cried silently in the dark corners of the temple, her tears falling onto the cold stone floors, unseen by the ever-watchful priests. Friendship and solidarity had become survival tools. Mutamwa, the Nubian girl she had met so long ago, remained her closest companion. Though words were rare, their shared glances and subtle gestures carried volumes. Together, they preserved fragments of memory, teaching each other songs of home in whispers only they could hear, and carving small symbols into hidden corners of their work to silently declare, "We are still here. We remember."